Thank you everyone so much for joining us today for our Outreach Champion Symposium. Our Outreach Champion program is one of the strands that have been part of Setting the Record Straight, which is a National Lottery Heritage funded project that we started just as the lockdown kicked in last year, and we're just getting to the end too. And the Outreach Champions have really been one of the key components of that project. So we'll be talking a little bit about the kind of wider project and then really honing in on the Outreach Champions, hearing from some of them today about what they've been working on and the research they've been doing. So yeah, I think we'll just get started.
This is also the fourth, I believe, of four symposiums that we have sort of running throughout our project. So it's with thanks to National Lottery players as well today that we're able to do this symposium, and we're able to sort of do these endeavours to sort of build this museum of youth culture. So it's always good to start by giving them a good shout before we begin.
So just to give you a little introduction for those of you that are kind of new to the museum, the Museum of Youth Culture is an emerging museum that's dedicated to the styles, sounds, social movements, and also everyday lives of young people here in the UK. The museum collections itself were built up from the collections of Youth Club Archive, which is a collection of over 150,000, mainly photographs, but also objects, ephemera, and now oral histories that all document the youth experience. And really our mission as the museum is to preserve, share, and celebrate this amazing story. It's one that's so often been overlooked, or it's not really seen as a designated area of heritage. And we really believe that this amazing story needs its own space dedicated to it. And that's really what we're working on at the moment.
That's definitely what it's about. And just like as Lisa says, just sort of realizing that youth culture is currently a sort of undesignated topic is really sort of where we started from with this project, and realizing that, even though we've got this incredible archive already, there's much to be done with it. And this is actually an example of what our archive actually looks like. So it was founded back in 1997 by our director, John, who started a magazine called Sleaze Nation. The magazine was collecting images of youth culture, and that might be images of teddy boys or punks or skinheads, the sort of stereotypical subcultural scenes that you would expect to see when you sort of search for youth culture, or you look at a youth culture archive. These are the sort of the draws that sort of started out that whole process. And these are all photographic slides. So with all of these drawers, we have a selection of photographs that have been copied from the original slide format. And you can sort of see here in the way that they have been originally categorized as well. And that's sort of really important to remember today, because the whole sort of purpose of this project is to set the record straight. And this sort of categorized process we've got at the moment, which is, as you can see here, we've got jungle, drum and bass. We've sort of been steering away from those music genres and actually moving to a little bit more of an inclusive narrative, some sort of genres or sort of categories, if you like, that can cover more than just music.
The archive itself, when it was founded back in the late 90s, a big reason of why it was started, and I think a big part of the work we do now, was this realization that no one was trying to pull together this amazing story and these photographs, and that it was really at risk of being lost. And I think that kind of drive to kind of really preserve this story kind of stays at the heart of the museum and the work that we do.
So a key element of building this museum is all about bringing in people and bringing them together. I mean, those initial slides that you've seen, they've got a sort of a good history that sort of covers, I guess, a more academic sort of structure that you'd expect to see in a sociology book, showing you the history of youth culture and where it's come from in a post-war world. But the idea has always been about building a museum that everyone can be part of. And I think it's always been a sort of a nice idea to be able to say that every single person can be part of this museum. And that could be anyone that's got a picture or a story of their youth, which in turn, I guess, covers everybody. So this is about sort of building a museum that is really inclusive, but celebrates the sort of unique period of life of growing up, and the sort of self-expression and that sort of coming together, and the way that period sort of reflects on your adulthood as well. So we've been really critical in this last year because we've been lottery funded for the last 3 times. So we've had about 4 years now of lottery funding, actually maybe even more. And that they've been funding us to do this vital work, looking at what we have, and then sort of challenging it and saying, what don't we have? We've had a conversation as a team, and we thought about 2 years ago, we thought, we're sort of ready to build a space and sort of get our collections out there and actually start formulating a museum. But actually we thought, maybe we should take a step back first and start to sort of consult the public and ask them what their youth was like, rather than assuming that our archive covers everything.
I think it was quite a liberating thing. I think when we first started officially saying out loud, we want to build a museum, this is our end goal, we started to have the discussions of what that museum looks like. And I think in many ways, the kind of project that we're talking about today has been kind of a couple of years in the making of us really changing our collections to look at how we can tell a much wider story and how we can really represent the different experiences of growing up in the UK.
And the project's taken us on some crazy journeys actually over the last year and a half. And those started out as being physical journeys where we would actually go to physical spaces and put on an event. And we called those scanning socials. So we started out finding a location where we knew that we were in need of images from or stories. And one of those locations happened to be the 59 Club, the motorcycle club that started out in 1959 in East London. We went to the clubhouse that still exists, and we brought a scanner and we started scanning in their archive. We put on events like that to sort of gather this sort of inclusive picture of youth culture. But it also required us to actually physically go to a space, sort of pre sort of market that event so the people that are coming know to bring a photograph and then scan. And in a way it worked well for us to start with, but it was sort of a clunky process because there's more to it than just sort of asking people for images. It requires you to actually be there. Growing Up in Britain has become the sort of overarching campaign that we've been working towards over the last year and a half. And this is sort of really where this symposium today really sort of brings that all together, because we've sort of said to people that if you've grown up in Britain and you've got a story to tell about your youth, that needs to become part of the museum.
Growing Up in Britain, we started kind of taking on public submissions for the first time in 2019. So it started with the 59 Club, and then there was a tentative call out in Time Out. And even in that 1 year that kind of ran, quite low key in many ways, we were just blown away by this kind of new collection of personal photographs and stories and memories that was coming in. And kind of following that success, Growing Up in Britain has really been our flagship campaign. And it's really for us to say, we're building a museum of youth culture. It's going to happen, but you can be part of that museum. You can help us build that museum, and your story counts. And that's been really exciting to see how we're now getting a collection that sits really nicely alongside our professional photographer archives. And they really speak to each other about the kind of different experiences people go through when they're a teenager, the highs and lows. We say from first jobs to first loves, family holidays and Saturday hangouts. So it's really kind of encompassing all the different aspects of really that period of trying to find yourself.
It's worth mentioning as well that before the start of lockdown, I guess, the sort of last year, I guess we're sort of working more with other organizations that already had a collection. That was sort of the most sort of lucrative way of us getting images. So for example, the image behind is from a youth club that's in Southwark, which is where we're based in London. And that was one of those images that sort of came from an already gathered collection, an already sort of gathered archive, if you like. So the exciting sort of element of this last year has been actually steering away from those sort of established archives and starting to sort of reach out to the public and actually get people to individually submit.
And at the heart, Growing Up in Britain is really a community archiving project, and in many ways, even an anthropological project. When we started it, our goal was to travel across the UK doing all these events, and that's something we'll definitely still do after lockdown. But it's really about working with different organizations, whether that's community centers or youth groups or kind of small heritage organizations, and trying to tell a story of an area or a place through stories of growing up and being young. It's a really great way and a really great lens through which to look at our social history. And I think one thing we've definitely learned over the course of the lockdown and the work we've been doing is the power of youth and collecting youth to really bring people together, because there's so many things that kind of bring us together and so many similar experiences we have, but also so many differences across generations and across the UK, and kind of connecting people in that way, you get really interesting discussions.
And definitely a vision that we still have for this project, lockdown allowing, is that we go to different parts of the UK, and we go to a town, we gather images from that town, from those people, and then we will then showcase what we found within that town. We ran an amazing project in Clacton-on-Sea that was a pilot project that was Arts Council funded last year at the start of the year, as a sort of way of seeing how a small town reacts to us coming in and sort of holistically working with them to gather material and ask people about what their youth was like. So we started doing that, and then of course lockdown happened. Luckily we managed to finish that project, and then we sort of had this sort of wider scope and a series of sort of like digital challenges to face. So one of the biggest sort of elements of this project, called Setting the Record Straight, is the outreach champions. Now, we've always had members of the public submitting to us in a sort of passive way. They might see what we do and send us a few pictures. They might drop us an email. But in general, it's been photographers that are sort of professional or have gone out and shot a certain scene. And that's obviously an incredible part of our archive and definitely serves as the backbone of what the museum is. But we sort of realized that there was a real need to actually gather human stories from people that were actually there, and people that actually have access to these communities that we're sort of not representing. And part of the lottery funding was to sort of steer more narratives into the archive, particularly those from LGBTQ plus histories, also BAME backgrounds, other places in the UK that aren't London as well, because obviously we're an archive that's based in London. We organically grow quite largely in that area. And also we began a series of fellowships with the Institute of Historical Research as part of the University of London. So we've had actual research essays written from academics about certain areas of youth culture to sort of add a new narrative to the collections as well. And alongside that, the project's been generally around actually going through that slide archive that you've seen and starting to restructure the categories. Categories that sort of are more inclusive and steer away from bias, institutional bias, and also are just seen as a little bit more reflective of everybody's lives. So, as opposed to sort of saying rave, it might say music venue instead, and starting to sort of open up those categories where the sort of subcultures are starting to sort of merge together, and then that allows space for the more mainstream, I guess, people to sort of fit within that as well. So it's sort of creating space for people in the collection.
Here you can see a little photo of kind of the reorganizing and the kind of post-it notes on drawers that we started putting together, but you can see kind of drawers like leisure. So I guess moving away, as Jamie was saying, from subcultures, but also from really specific themes, which the archive was organized by before. It was really, really specific, and you kind of had to really know what you were looking for. So trying to move away from that and look at ways we can kind of pull together just different generations and different movements in one area. So, under leisure, having, activities, sports, dancing, having a kind of going out section that kind of encompasses different musics and different types of going out. So yeah, we're hoping that this kind of different way of storytelling will enable us to build a more inclusive narrative that's much more flexible and open and intuitive to use as well.
And of course, there's always this sort of brilliant chaos to an archive in general. I mean, we're probably quite organized in comparison to lots of archives we've seen, but we could be better as well. But it's just also, I sort of love this process where you can see we've uplifted everything and we're in the process of putting it back in a new space. And obviously those categories that, like Lisa mentioned, are like were really useful and served a purpose when the archive used to be working for a magazine and serving that magazine, but now it's serving a museum's narrative. So it's quite exciting to see that we're uncovering images and uncovering new content in ways that we wouldn't have before, because we might not have looked in that box, or might not have been sort of looking for that specific genre. So yeah, it's a sort of a real upheaval.
So we're here today specifically to talk about our Outreach Champion program. So we were really trying to think of different ways of collecting where we could bring in voices and stories that are currently underrepresented in the archives, but also to make sure that those stories are being told by people that are part of the community, that it's really about self-representation. And so the Outreach Champion came out of that. It's a program where we've worked with 10 people from kind of communities where we're definitely lacking in stories, and then kind of giving the reins over to them and saying, what stories do you feel we are missing, and how do you think we should tell that story, represent that story within our collections and within the museum? And I think it's pretty safe to say, Jamie, that we were really blown away by what we got back. You know, just to give a bit of a perspective over it, we got nearly 70 hours of oral history submitted as part of the project, which is just really amazing, as well as, you know, up to, I think, 1,000 images and ephemera from areas where we were really kind of lacking as an archive. And, you know, I think it's been really exciting for us to see how this program can start taking steps towards redressing imbalances within the collection.
It really is. It's just absolutely incredible, because every single photograph is so personal to someone. And I think every time we would go to an event and someone would pass an image over, you always feel sort of indebted to that person, because it really, really opens up the story of youth culture. And it's so exciting to see that so many people are so willing to contribute. It's also just worth mentioning, alongside this, over lockdown, we launched a sort of wider, just sort of generic public call out as well. And during that campaign, we had 4,000 people sign up to say they're interested in submitting, and around half of that submit images as well. So we've had over 2,000 images that have come in from the general public, and that could just be sort of mods, you know, ravers, some sort of kids hanging out. But it's really, really opened up the archive alongside this, and this sort of Outreach Champion program alongside Burn Up in Britain has really started to sort of basically support each other and become a sort of very sort of symbiotic relationship as the archive grows.
Alongside this work, we've also been really keen to continue our work with more elderly groups. Before lockdown kicked in, we were doing a lot of work with care homes, but also dementia cafes, using the archive to spark memories and really focusing kind of the well-being element and the power the collection has in that way. And we really felt that, you know, at a time when those people are most at risk, when there's a kind of high level of isolation, we can really use the archive to kind of connect people and work with people. So throughout the lockdown, we developed kind of activities and workshops that we shared with care homes and kind of other charities that work with over 65s, from, you know, a youth culture hotline that people can call to share their memories, and kind of free postage postcards where people can send us their stories, to more extensive kind of in the box workshops that have been in care homes for people to run workshops and activities with their residents. So it's been really exciting to see that and kind of see the power the collections and the story of youth has in working with people.
And also sort of, we've been really sort of trying to strive to grow during this period as well. So instead of sort of, you know, sort of succumbing to the sort of restrictions of lockdown and mothballing and things like that, we thought, let's really try and make this work for us. And I think, you know, just seeing the submissions come in was a sort of really sort of confidence boosting thing for us. It's very validating to see that the public during lockdown have been sort of really nostalgic and wanting to show and tell their stories. But we also opened up a retail unit just off Carnaby Street, which we turned into a gallery space, and we called it the Museum of Youth Culture Pop-Up Arts Lab. And that sort of took inspiration from the Arts Lab movement that happened in the 1960s. David Bowie was famously part of the early days of it. But we opened up a space where we had it was basically a temporary shop, but we also used it to film video within it. And we had a gallery downstairs which had 1960s Salford youth. So it was a real, you know, sort of exciting way of, even during a pandemic, working with the lockdown tiers to put on a cultural display in central London. Unfortunately, we've just moved out of that space actually, but we will be moving into another one soon.
So we're going to move over to some presentations from our outreach champions now, talking about the work that they've been doing and the stories they've been collecting. So I'm really excited to introduce to you our first outreach champion, which is Amal Malik. She is a final year history student at the University of Warwick with a research focus on gender and queer history. And she's been looking specifically at stories from the South Asian diaspora in the UK. So Amal, if you want to unmute, and it's all yours.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Amal. So I'm a final year history undergraduate. And I guess a quick overview of when I first started the project. It aligned quite well because I was doing my early dissertation research, which is actually focusing on South Asian women. So I think my main focus as like an outreach champion was mainly to collect from South Asian communities, particularly with like a gender focus, and that was looking at women and also queer communities. Maybe just because of like being a queer woman myself, I was like looking for people to relate to, because I think with archives, overwhelmingly they can, I think in a generic way, not be as interpersonal when you first kind of think of an archive. But I guess with everything shifting online, it's a really good opportunity to kind of change and diversify what an archive really means. So I guess my focus was largely oral interviews. So I held around 10 to 15, I think. And the main reason for that was mainly because like in the communities I come from, like oral tradition is quite a big part of actually sharing family history. Images and like pictures and like passing on recipes and things like that are really important, but word of mouth was something that I thought would be a really accessible way of actually approaching it. So for a lot of my approaches, I think I wanted just to create a bit of a safe space for people to come forward in. So I did quite a generic set of questions really, and it was mainly about just letting people have that kind of space to talk about what they really needed to about growing up in Britain, because I think being brown in the UK, there's so many more obstacles that you face, whether it be through structural racism, through living in areas that aren't very diverse, through community pressures, and like a multitude of reasons. So offering just a very plain space where I would send questions beforehand so people would be more comfortable at least knowing what they were entering, was a really big part of it, just to kind of avoid, I think, quite stereotypical narratives of what it means to talk about being like diaspora in the UK, of being brown in the UK, because I think there's quite a traditional narrative of the immigrant coming of age story of like, we're working hard in the face of racism and it's all worth it, and it's really like a lot of romanticism, but the reality of it is can be a lot of trauma, living on really fragmented lines of like racism and navigating being brown and British. So I think that was the main initiative of it, and I got some really interesting, really moving interviews actually, particularly with people from queer communities as well, that were really, I think, the ones that stood out to me, especially in the face of like growing homophobic attacks more recently in areas like Birmingham and London. So I guess a lot of the interviews were quite intergenerational as well. So one of the pictures here is like a photo booth strip. Her name's Sahara Ali. She's a I Will ambassador. She's quite young. I think she's only like 15. But I wanted to make sure, like, when we do present interviews, this is something for future generations to look back on as well. So it's kind of making sure it's like an archive, not just for the past, but also the present. So that was like a big intention behind it, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Amal. I mean, I think you did like 20 oral histories when I counted them. So you really brought a lot of stories in. So I think we'll just leave it at that, because at the end we'll have an opportunity for people to ask questions, and also to ask questions to individual kind of outreach champions if they want to. So up next, we've got Dan Glass. Dan is an AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, so ACT UP, healthcare and human rights activist, performer, presenter, and writer. And he's been focusing really on LGBTQ histories, but also kind of that important element of activism within that. So Dan, if you want to unmute yourself and turn your camera on, and up to you.
Hey, can you see me and hear me all right?
Yeah.
All good.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's so good to be here and everyone else's contributions as well. First one I remember when I first walked down Carnaby Street, it was the museum of art. You could start about something. A couple of years back, and I was like, so it's a real eye opener and a real honest part of the project. I guess being part of the LGBTQIA specific research angle with my work with Free People London and these times, this is such a kind of wide array of groups that I just wanted to acknowledge, the movements that I wanted to acknowledge. Night clubs like Trade and Ghetto and Pop Stars and I'm a Stash, Friends of the Joiners Arms, the Rebel Dice, the Radical Fairies movement. I just want to acknowledge people like Henry Moss, who was one of the key instigators behind Ghetto and Pop Stars, who left the building last year. We've had some amazing contributions from people like Bernard Scott of like British Houston at one of the key HIV awareness rallies in Hyde Park. Such soul food that we need at the moment. And I think one of the key things like for me is how all these pieces are connected, all our stories, all these cultures are connected, and all injustices are connected. And that's why it's so beautiful to see the different areas that you're bringing to life. And there's poems and love letters and paintings and photos of queer race and you'll be able to see in the archives as well. I guess the one last point I wanted to say is like, why are we doing this now? The 60th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front was last year, which led to the formation of Pride, which led to the first Pride in 1952. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of that. So it's really it's special time. And I was born out of the Black Power and women's liberation movement. And we're working in conjunction with British Institute and other archives to bring these connected histories to life. So it's really important and helpful to
Cool. Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. Like I said, again, if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll go back to them in a bit. If you want to
mention as well, thank you for that Dan, that was amazing. And we've actually also I've actually finished editing a video which is going to go live soon, which will be about, obviously, as we know, the key players within the early Gay Liberation Front. So that's soon to go live, and I'll be sharing that with you I think later today, actually, ready. So everyone keep an eye out on our YouTube channel for that to go live soon.
It looks brilliant, really exciting. So up next, we've got Eleanor Effleck. Eleanor is a recent graduate of the Goldsmiths MA Queer History and a zinester from Edinburgh. And she's also been looking at kind of experiences of growing up queer, both in photography, but also ephemera. So Elle, if you want to go ahead.
Hello. Yes, I'm Elle. I'm one of the LGBTQIA+ outreach champions. And yeah, I just finished my MA in queer history, which is obviously very helpful in doing this project. Some of my research interests there are approaches to queer public history, performing desire on stage, and zines and youth culture. I'm also a member librarian at the Edinburgh Zine Library, which is a collectively organised reference library of zines, which is in the Edinburgh Central Library. And that's also impacted the way I approached collecting for this project as well. And yeah, I've had a really great time working as an outreach champion for the museum. It's been really fun. I think in terms of my approach right off the bat, I think it's good to acknowledge that the stories that I've gathered were always to an extent going to be subjectively shaped by my own personal experience as a white middle-class queer person, and my own community networks as somebody who's involved in zines. Obviously, like, I've taken steps to mitigate that, but I think it's always good to acknowledge. And I just want to say a big thank you to my participants as well. I've had a lot of conversations about how it's important to make clear where I'm situated here as well. And I hope I've gone some of the way to bring light to new stories and ways of storytelling. But I think there's always more to do as well. When I first kind of came to the collection, I kind of thought, well, what does the museum already have? And because it grew out of a photography archive, obviously it's really strong on photographs. So I had to look in those collections to see what there was already that was specifically related to LGBTQIA+ history, and it kind of seemed to broadly fall under 3 categories. So we had some protests, like Section 28 protests in Manchester. There were some things about sort of venues and partying, lots of sort of Madame Jojo's in heaven, and there were some kind of figures from pop culture as well, so famous LGBTQ+ people such as Frankie Knuckles, the godfather of house, Queen Latifah, Jimmy Somerville, but it seemed that they were sort of like quite specific areas and times that were covered. It felt quite sort of like different snapshots, and as well as that, like, kind of the downside of a photography archive is that it is image-based, and LGBTQIA+ identities aren't necessarily always something that is going to be visible in an image or safe to be recorded in that way as well. So for that reason, when I was thinking about possible contributors, I wanted to focus on like different ways and like technologies that LGBTQIA+ community have made and like used to record our own history and our own voices. So it was kind of a combination of oral histories, youth groups, and the consciousness raising roles that they fulfill, zines, and publications, theatre, and technology. And this structured some of the questions that I asked my oral history contributors, and also influenced the people that I approached for contribution. In particular, I also wanted to include more non-binary and trans narratives, BAME narratives, again, sort of in line with the broader aims of the project, stories from areas that aren't London, and again, like information about LGBTQ+ youth groups. And I definitely don't think all of the work's done here, but I hope in at least like identifying and beginning to bring in these stories, we've kind of identified a lot of areas that we can carry on in as well. And I've been able to work with some really fantastic contributors. And again, the stuff that I've collected probably falls into 3 broad categories. You can see some of them up on this slide, but it's probably zines and fan culture, youth groups, and then oral histories as well. The zines and fan culture is in particular influenced by my own role as a zine librarian, and we now have a really great collection of zines reflecting on what it's like to grow up queer in the UK, covering everything from Bruce Springsteen to things that we wish we'd been taught in school about empire and colonialism, and you can see some of them there. And then I've also, we've got some really amazing photographs and stories from Greg Blatchford, who worked to set up the London Gay and Lesbian Teenage Group in the 1970s, as well as some other amazing oral histories talking about different experiences of growing up LGBTQ+ from all over the UK, some from zinesters sort of explaining a bit more about their zines and their process, and then some that are speaking to other aspects of growing up LGBTQ+ in the UK. We've got a play from Bedlam Chorus, which covers growing up LGBTQ+, and it's quite a brief summary, so this by no means covers everything, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to everyone being able to see it. And yeah, and I really liked like Amal's point about sort of collecting for future generations as well. That's also something that I've been quite mindful of. So for example, Queering the Art Classroom are quite a new organisation, but I think it's really important to document what's being done to bring LGBTQIA+ education and identity into schools, and I think they're a really good organisation to demonstrate that. I think my final note is that queer and LGBTQIA+ young people today still really need our support. I really recommend checking out organisations like Gendered Intelligence, All Sorts, Mosaic, 5 for 5, there are so many organizations around, and seeing what you can do to help support them. We've seen from the recent onslaught of transphobia in the media that progress can and shouldn't be taken for granted. And I think right now it can be a really difficult time to be an LGBT, especially T&I young person. So yeah, your solidarity is still needed now as much as ever. And yeah, that's me.
Amazing, thank you, Elle. And I think, yeah, it's a good point to raise about this idea of a living archive, and also kind of the empowerment that can hopefully bring to people, and kind of representing stories that are at risk or not being told. Up next, we've got Jez. Jez is the founder and director of the Birmingham Music Archive, and has been helping us collect stories from Birmingham in the Midlands, really focusing on working class stories. So Jez, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks. Hi all. Yeah, my name's Jez Collins, and I run the Birmingham Music Archive. And there's a lot of similarities between the Museum of Youth Culture and the work that I do, although I'm specifically focused on music and Birmingham. But the idea comes really from I think every speaker so far has said about the idea what constitutes an archive, whose voice is heard in an archive, what gets represented in an archive, and how is it represented. And a lot of my work at the Birmingham Music Archive is driven by the feeling I don't think that Birmingham really understands or celebrates its music history, heritage, and culture. And I'm trying to change that and say, actually, we have a very varied history. It's very diverse. It's sustained over a number of years. And if we actually sort of understand it, collect it, nurture it, archive it, preserve it, celebrate it, then we'll have a much better understanding of the role that music plays in the everyday lives of individuals and communities. And again, something that I think was said earlier around the idea of, archives and youth culture and everyday lives, they're entwined. And so my approach to the Outreach Champion was to find a range of people that I knew and some I didn't know, that was, understood or took an approach to diversity across its broadest sense. We often, when we think about diversity, we automatically or tend to head towards race, colour, gender, sexuality, sometimes disability, but class is often left out of that discussion. It's an afterthought and something we bring in. For me, through my politics, class underpins everything. It's the root of everything. So I tried to get a spread of not just working class, but class-based people, and hear their stories, because as I said earlier, you often don't see working class people represented in mainstream archives or museums. And just before I talk about some of the stories, something that Amal touched on earlier as well, what we are doing, both as outreach ambassadors and champions, and as organisations, the Birmingham Music Archive and the Museum of Youth Culture, is a form of activist archiving or community archiving, citizen archiving, because there are those absences. And because our stories aren't told, however we class ourselves, marginalised, or through our ethnicity or through our sexuality, we undertake these types of projects. We take control of these types of projects. We tell our stories with our voices, and these are incredibly important resources. And the things that are coming on screen in now and in previous ones, and I'm sure in ones to come, are the sort of the materials that people keep under their beds, in the shoebox, in their garage, in their lofts, because they're incredibly important to them. They give us a sense of our identity, our cultural identity, in my case, musical identity, but they tell stories, or they help prompt tell stories, which are, as I said, incredibly important. So my approach to this particular task, which I have to say was really nice, because being wrapped up in the Birmingham Music Archive and working in projects, you're obviously in the middle of it, and it doesn't really give you that much time to reflect and stop and think about your own practice. So being an outreach champion for the Museum of Youth Culture and the Growing Up in Britain project allowed me to actually reflect on my own practices and approach the the interviews that I undertook, I think we did 11 or 12 in the end, all history interviews, and reflect on the types of approaches. And it was quite, it's been quite instructful, I think, and insightful. Challenges, of course, because we couldn't do probably 3/4 of them because of lockdown. And I found that a challenge. You know, I much prefer to be in front of someone and you read their body language, you read their mannerisms, you strike up a different type of relationship. But as I say, we undertook 11 interviews, and just you can see some of the images on front of you. The interviews, or the people I spoke to, range from fairly established hip hop stars who've traveled the world and been part of signed to record labels, to Asian youth who have grown up and fallen into journalism with Asian newspapers and then become part of the Bhangra scene in Birmingham, to working class youths who I've grown up with, who lived on huge council estates, who, you know, were always told they weren't going to amount to anything. Their you know, options were quite limited, but are now, in my eyes, successful. You know, whatever they're doing, running music events and whatnot, and we're still friends. So I really appreciated the spread of diversity, and I tried to approach it in a chronological order. So prior to interviews, you know, I'd speak to the person concerned and say, well, look, you send me some of your images, whatever they may be. You know, we've got some flyers there, we've got an old photo, passport photograph, we've got friends in pubs, friends on bandstands, someone playing sports. Send me those, and I'll use those as sort of prompts and navigation points, I suppose, through the interview. And I tended to, I don't know if I did this you know, on purpose, but I tended to array them in chronological, what I thought were chronological order, so you could see perhaps the age, or the images would tell a story of the development of that person, and that seemed to work for me. So it was quite linear in some respects, but what that enabled us to do is to really jump off at different points. And I think Jamie said about 70 hours of oral histories. I think one of them with Muhammad Ali was about 3.5 hours long. So I'm really sorry about that. We just, you know, talked and talked and talked, but he, you know, really got into it. He was quite reserved at first, I think. And as we talked more, and images of his family came out, images of himself and his practice as a street artist came out, he became much more open, and it was a wide-ranging discussion about class diversity, racism, art. You know, it was a really nice interview. So it's as I say, broad brush approach, but really for me, as someone who considers themselves, you know, who's done lots of these types of interviews for academic work, for my own practice, it was a really good way to stop and reflect on trying to find out the things I'm interested in, how to talk to people in subjects that, you know, I often don't talk about.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jez. I mean, it's really nice to have, I think yours is the main one that's really focused on a location. And I think that's really nice to have this kind of collection of stories that is outside of London and kind of talks about the stories and memories of growing up there. We've got some questions that have come in, so we'll go back to those later on when we've got a bit of a Q&A. So we'll just move on to Mira Mikada. She's a research historian with an interest in South Asian diasporic culture. And for this project, she looks specifically at the Asian underground dance scene, which we've got a little bit of in the archive, but really not enough until now. So Mira, if you want to go ahead.
Hi. So I'm an archive-based researcher, and of course I'm interested in looking at how we can document and celebrate these stories that have just been on the margins. I think with dance culture, especially kind of in the general discourse as well as in archives. So my interest really started when I was still volunteering at the youth club, and I found a photograph taken at Anoka, which was a night at Blue Note in Hoxton. And I was probably 21, 22 at the time, and I still hadn't ever seen something like that. So just seeing, I guess, like Asian representation in the club scene, or in partying generally was just so new to me. And I think the more time you spend in archives, you kind of see what's missing with even more kind of intensity. So to be able to look at clubbing and music subcultures through the kind of South Asian diaspora lens was definitely something I felt would go a long way to addressing some of those gaps. I actually started off just obviously trying to find out as much as I could online, and again was really surprised by the lack of information. Like I just thought, you know, it's the internet, surely I'm gonna find some leads. But I was just kind of cold calling, cold emailing people who I saw typing in like keywords on Twitter. So just names of club nights, hoping somebody might have tweeted like reminiscing about Anarcha 5 years ago, and just reaching out to them and hoping they would get back to me. But it really did pay off getting into touch with all these people. And I just got to talk to actually people who are really pioneers in the Asian underground scene, especially female DJs, which growing up myself, like I'd never seen that representation. I hadn't like heard those stories. So I think my approach was definitely, like you guys were saying about your own position in your research, like as much learning about myself and my own identity, as well as for the future generations, for sure. The scene, the Asian underground scene, actually turned out to have not been photographed as extensively as I thought it might have been. And every time I asked somebody about why there wasn't as many pictures, they just laughed and said nobody was carrying around cameras in the club, which was fair enough. But that kind of opened the door towards flyers and ephemera, which actually I think just spoke a lot about kind of visual identities, like the DIY ethos, but also just differences within the subculture. So you can see some of the different flyers up there. The Outcast flyers were some of my favorite. It was actually, I met DJ Ritu, who turned out to have a huge closet just full of material, which I was so honored that she let me just take my time and go through that. And she started Outcast, the club night and the record label, co-founded it in 1994. And I just thought the name, the logo, like I just thought it really just captured that time of, I guess, like being between two cultures, but also just approaching it with such like humor and wit, which I loved. And also newspaper clippings from the time I thought added a lot to kind of how Western audiences were seeing this kind of boom in Asian nightlife. So even though there wasn't photographs, I think kind of the extensive collection of flyers and clippings with oral history really painted like a picture of the time that maybe even photographs wouldn't have been able to capture. And also vinyl covers, sorry, that was the other thing. On the top right, you can see it's the album cover art for the Suarez Compilation that was released in 1997. And I spoke to Ajay, who was kind of the brain behind putting the album together, which provided kind of a platform for Asian artists who hadn't been that popular yet, or kind of put them side by side with people who are achieving like mainstream success already. But I just think the kind of graphic design on that, like the nod to Bollywood, and even the name Swaraj, which means self-rule, it's borrowed from the independence movement, was really interesting for me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mira. I think it was really interesting because I remember us having a conversation like 3 or 4 years ago about the Asian underground scene and its representation in the archive. So it was great to have you working on this. So for the final ones, I'm just going to talk about the outreach champions that aren't here. First up here, we've got Sonia. Sonia actually was one of the first people to submit to the Museum of Youth Culture when we launched our public submissions campaign in 2019. So she's actually the punk in the top right. And for this project, she's a researcher in women and punk music. And for this research project specifically, she looked at Black women in subcultures. So she did a series of oral histories as well as kind of photo collections for all of those. Then we've got Chardine Taylor-Stone. She's a LGBTQ activist, and she's been doing a lot of research in punk as well. She's been looking a bit more at alternative subcultures again, but also looking at the experiences of growing up in more rural and smaller market towns. So kind of moving away from kind of the urban environment and looking at kind of the experiences of growing up in smaller towns. Again, a series of photographs and oral histories that she's been working on. And lastly, we had Esther Freeman. She's a researcher in women's activism and protest. So she's really been looking at kind of some of the women behind protest movements here in the UK, from kind of Rock Against Racism to kind of bigger kind of South Asian anti-racism protests to kind of the squatting and land rights movement. And again, it's a series of mainly oral histories with those people. And those are the outreach champions we've worked with so far. So I think for now, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into a bit of a group discussion with the panel, just a couple of questions around the project more widely and kind of how this could potentially be the future of collecting for the Museum of Youth Culture. And then there'll be some time for you to ask questions as well. I see some have already been posted in the chat. So if you've got any that come up, again, just pop them in there and we'll kind of go back to those in about 10, 15 minutes. Should we go out of screen share maybe?
Sure.
Amazing. So thank you all for doing your short little presentations. It was super interesting. But I think one question for everyone, and some of you have already touched on it already. When we applied for setting the record straight and the funding, the world looked a lot different than it does today. And the outreach champion was very much envisioned as something very physical and kind of doing loads of events. And of course, because of the way everything turned out, it's been very much remote and virtually. How has it been for you as researchers, kind of collecting these oral histories, having to do everything remote or online? And yeah, if anyone just wants to jump in and kind of go ahead.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I touched on it when I was talking. It is difficult. I think you know the interviews. You can still do the oral history interviews as we're doing now. You can record them, but for me, you do lose a sense of that connectivity to the individual. I knew quite a few of mine, so it was a bit, you know, it wasn't so difficult. But I felt that some of the interviews would have been a bit more focused, perhaps, or they would have revealed more of the personal histories from people, because you still have this barrier. You have a barrier when you see people face to face, but you do things to put people at ease. You know, you have a discussion beforehand, and you see, as I say, just things like, you know, hand movements like this. I tend to, when I'm on screen, I tend to look at my window. I don't tend to look into the camera. So those sorts of things do change or challenge, I think, in terms of oral history interviews. In terms of collecting, in terms of my practice as well, it's still the same. You know, that's the great thing about digital, that you don't have to be in the same place or room as people. Scanning things is difficult because you have to physically sometimes scan photographs or whatever it might be. But yeah, for me, the biggest challenge has been, you know, the lack of ability to have face-to-face interviews with people and have that personal connection, because I think it might have been Jamie said it earlier, or it might be one of the questions. You know, people are, you know, opening themselves up to you. It can be quite a vulnerable situation when they're talking about personal issues, and I'm sure just listening to people's sort of broad subject terms, I'm sure there's a lot of, you know, very deep personal histories and stories coming out. So yeah, for me, it's just that lack of connectivity that was impinged some of the work.
I think for us as well, from our side, like, you know, we can't always, you know, represent the depth of those stories, and I think that's sort of where it's so important that you guys have been able to sort of bring in stories from areas where you know, we don't have those connections, or maybe don't have that sort of sensitivity to be able to approach that, you know, that sort of community. So I think that's sort of where this Outreach Champion sort of program has been so successful, really. But I wonder, I mean, because some of you guys have actually done physical collecting. I wonder, like, if anybody has anything to say about what that was like during the sort of lockdown, or sort of the, you know, loosened up version of lockdown.
I mean, I can speak about it a wee bit if you want, just because I do have some physical collections. I think in a way, like, it's interesting because, like, zines are such a physical thing, and so much of the process of zine making is like a very tactile, like, physical experience. And I think sort of like even with Zine Library as well, we've been trying to find ways of still having that experience while also being COVID safe. I think a lot of it has been, in a way, like, kind of leaning into the fact that, like, well, this is an archive of like LGBTQIA plus history, and well, we're like, it's also going to be an archive of like what it's like to archive during COVID as well. And I think kind of just embracing that was quite nice. Like, but I mean, a lot of what I did was just through the post, like, and I think that's kind of something that in a way feels quite authentic to zine culture, because like, a lot of the folk that I know, like, we were already posting each other's zines, we were already making zines over posts, so it's quite nice to still be able to have that exchange, even if you can't go to zine fairs and meet people in person and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it has been different, but also I think there's still aspects of it that have, yeah, again, a lot of post and email and that kind of thing.
That's amazing that it's even possible, because I think when this first happened, we were all a bit like, you know, can we even run this side of the project? That was the first thought, you know, and the fact that people are still open to sharing, maybe even more so now, because they've got time to think and time to reflect.
Yeah,
that's definitely had an impact.
Do you think people, I guess this is for everyone, do you think people were more responsive or easier to reach out to because I think people were at home more? So that kind of element of trying to plan an interview with someone was maybe a bit easier because they had nowhere else to go.
Not for me, no. Look, I'm just looking again at the list of people, and there, a lot of them came from the creative or public sector, and they were either worrying about work, or worrying about, you know, going to work, or worrying about not having work. So I think, look, I'm just checking my list. Majority of them were either key workers or in the creative and arts sector. So it took some what's the word? Took some persuasion or a lot of chasing. Let me put it that way, to get dates.
Also, I think I was just going to add that I think people's relationship with technology has just changed a lot in the lockdown, and like, either people have spent more time on their phones, or some people just do not want to spend their free time like having more video calls and more emails, which I completely understood, and I was sympathetic to that because I felt the same. So I think sometimes when you did finally get together, there was kind of already like a shared sense of something.
Mira, you actually, it was DJ Ritu, wasn't it, who actually showed, let you physically go to her collection, is that right?
Yeah, I was really lucky that I, because her collection was so big, and the email she said, like, she was like, I don't even want to open those cupboard doors and get involved with whatever's in there. So I was like, okay, that's great, that's my dream, I'll come over there and do it. Which I was really happy about, because I could go. but when I got there, it was in the middle of like the heat wave, and obviously following like the COVID restrictions, I was trying to stick to the one room where the material was, literally just sweating in there, like with these flyers and clippings. But it was worth it. And I also got to meet Ajay on his doorstep, and he gave me one of the original vinyls, and he brought out like a record player so we could listen to it like outside, socially distanced. But I also think the Asian underground scene being a music subculture, just immersing myself in the music kind of helped a lot with bonding with people over Zoom and stuff afterwards. That would have been a lot more difficult, I think, without that.
I think you've definitely opened up a wormhole in the archive that needs to grow, because I'm seeing, I mean, all of you guys have done that. You've opened up areas where, you know, we've seen this and met this content and we're like, oh my God, this is just the beginning, isn't it? You know, this has been for all of us, I think, a sort of pilot study to see how it might work to bring in new material. Dan, I know that you've been sort of emailing loads, and you were just sort of, how have you found people just in general?
How have I found people in general? It's in terms of like our ability to connect. I think, you know, I think we get to do it, and I think we get it right from here. It's just such a joy to see. I think, the third lockdown, I don't know, you know, the impact of like not in all carnival, has such a profound effect on its social, physiological, sociological level. It's so intense because of justice and accountability and everything. I think the ripple effect is huge. For any cultural movement, we want to engage with what's going on in the world. I think as soon as we are out of lockdown and simultaneously, we need to have the important conversations about how can we can breathe life to ourselves and each other. We stand up for what we believe in. And I think by through documenting and connecting, understanding and learning and seeing all the incredible contributions that people do it is really inspiring to see that we have a roadmap the way forward. But why I think is that especially gemstones of like counterculture has to be that before rather than because otherwise you know we always debate context we don't want to be on together. We have to get that and feel each other in ways that we need to.
That's cool. It's been an intense time, I think, definitely.
Yeah, and just to pose it to you as well, Mal, because you were doing you did a lot of cold emailing and kind of reaching out to people you didn't necessarily know, and you also had quite a lot of anonymous interviews. Do you think that the kind of distance and the Zoom setup almost helped a bit with that?
I think, to be honest, like the hardest thing was that I was living at home during that time, and we didn't have proper internet connection in my room. Like it just wasn't going into my room. So I think the thing was, it would have made it a lot easier being able to do like face-to-face interviews. So I think that would have added the personal element. But because I was doing it at home, often the interviews had like quite sensitive topics, which I think are like quite conservative, taboo. It can be quite in quite conservative communities, that can be quite taboo, a lot of things we're talking about. So they want to keep it quite private. So a lot of it just ended up being me sorting out phone calls upon phone calls and like sitting my phone right next to my laptop, trying to record it on voice memos and making sure it's like the clearest angle. So I'm hoping they came out clearly, but that was quite tricky, yeah, because a lot of them were like anonymous by nature. And because of them, yeah, they were quite there was some very personal issues they were talking about. So I think that also probably they were less welcoming to that idea of like a face-to-face thing. So I think that did help. But I had a really big spreadsheet of like about 100 people that I initially emailed. Eventually got some people to respond, which was good. Yeah.
Amazing. No, I think it's been exciting for us to see just the oral histories interviews that have come in, both from this project and kind of other projects we've done this past year, because I think before this point we didn't really have any. So that was really exciting for us. And one thing that Jamie already touched upon, you know, with this kind of opening of a wormhole, in terms of having been part of the Outreach Champion program, how do you feel that a program like this can help redress imbalances in collections and kind of champion mission, kind of missing voices, and kind of as a future program for the Museum of Youth Culture to continue?
Sorry, Liz, can you just, I'm really sorry, I've got a family member who's really ill with COVID, like seriously, and I'm getting loads of messages, so I'm a bit distracted. I missed that question, sorry.
I'm sorry to hear that, Jez. I hope that
everyone, loads of people are in it. Sorry.
No, I was just saying about kind of using a program like this to really look at how you can redress imbalances in collections, both of the Museum of Youth Culture, but also as kind of a way of collecting for museums more widely, and kind of thinking of this as kind of the first step in a future program for the museum.
Well, seeing I asked you to repeat the question, I should try and answer it. It's massively important. It's hugely important. I said earlier that you know, these types of projects and the stories that people are telling, and the things that they're collecting, whether it's oral histories or the photographs or the posters, flyers, whatever it might be, are you know, often aren't deemed to be of importance to be collected and preserved within mainstream archives, museums, record offices, whatever. And so they're at risk of being lost, and they hold massively important historical information. And I'm not talking about in 10 years time, you know, I'm not talking about a flyer from, you know, the Asian underground in the 80s and 90s being important in the year 2020. I'm talking about being important in the year, you know, 2090 and whatever, 2020, 100, whatever year that is, that year, 2000, the year 20, whatever it is, next century, let me put it that way. They're really important. And if these projects aren't supported, and people like ourselves don't collect these artifacts and these stories, then we'll have no history, and we'll have no, you know, without your history, it's a bit of a cheesy phrase, but if you don't know your history, you can't influence your future. You know, you need in all our work, in our different ways, you know, we need people who look like us, who talk like us, who act like us, who live where we live, to be able to see themselves recognized within these types of collections. So it's massively important. And part of my interest and work is to say to museums, mainstream museums or archives, or, you know, professionals versus amateurs, I suppose is another way of putting it, but to say, well, how can we work together? Because they have huge skills and understanding, expertise within preservation, cataloguing, indexing, sometimes in curating. But they're not very agile, or they don't have the links into the community that people like we have. So how can we work together to create these more holistic approaches to collection and celebration of you know, what is really, I suppose, working class or ordinary histories?
I think it was also a way of sort of maybe reworking that question to other people as well, is maybe what do you think this is sort of like a sustainable model in terms of the way that we ask for people to, you know, provide us with content? Or you know, do you think there's anything about this method that the way that we've approached you that could have been more efficient, or could have been better, or things that were, or maybe you think that it is a good model, like maybe this is how we're going to roll it out, and we're going to just, you know, reach out to people across the nation and do it this way? But yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts around that.
I honestly thought it was a really good model when it came to actually reaching out to a lot of people. I think particularly when it comes to, like Jess was saying, like informing our future generations. I think for me, a lot of it was that for young people who want to kind of understand their history, especially for like young South Asians, representational history is really important, but also kind of knowing that your roots are like justified and they are here. I think for a lot of like, when it comes to considering races in the UK, where people say like go back to your country, things like that, like it's really important for future generations to be able to look back and like, oh my God, these are my roots. These are like, I can visually see it, I can hear it. Like I have a place, like I have a place where I feel comfortable and I'm safe in this country. And it's part of my identity. Like I can feel just as British as I can South Asian. And I think we're at a really good point where we have projects like this, where it's like, there's so much hybridity of people's different cultures, the intersections of like their queerness and their race, what position of class they're in, like which part of the country, what cities they live in, like. And I think it's really important that you just continue allowing these kind of diverse stories to kind of pan out in a way that is accessible to people. So like I know for like, this would be really good for like younger, like high school students. I think this would be really a fun way of being like, let me record my family's history, because so much can be lost. So this can be like a really, I think, quite straightforward way that I think people can access history. Yeah.
Oh, that's really nice feedback. Thank you.
I like the idea of education as well. We did develop in the lockdown like a key stage 3 or 4 kind of resource that asked young people to interview their parents and grandparents about their experiences of growing up, and using that as an angle through which to look at our social history. So I think it's definitely something that we'd like to explore more once we can actually go back to schools and kind of speak to people more directly. But I think, yeah, there's a real power in that.
Can I just add on just what you said, Lisa, and to Amal? What's another really interesting, important facet of this sort of work, particularly with the oral histories, is that, you know, if I think about the Black community, particularly the Black male community in Birmingham, maybe 50, 60 years old, maybe a bit older. When I talk to them about music, they'll say to me that their youth, you know, their family, the youth around them, don't know anything about the struggles that they went through and the things that they've done and how they've laid a path. So they have a whole dynamic about, you know, they make this music, this grime, and, you know, they have no understanding about the legacy and the history of their own music and their own culture. So these types of projects often, as well, it's not just a way of preserving, and I think I over-egged that about preserving and inspiring future generations. It's a validation of the individual and of individual cultures and communities about themselves. And then it's how you then said, Lisa, how do we then use that to go back and make that connection between the generations? So again, it's such an important part of work that we do. We often just think about the collecting and the celebrating, but there's so much more once we have these stories or these artifacts within an archive, however you say that. There's so much we can do with them.
Did anyone else want to add anything to that? Mira, or Dan, or Elle?
I mean, I guess like briefly, yeah, I think to echo what Jez was saying, I think the fact that it's intergenerational is really good. Just the fact that it's funded also, and that like, I think the fact that you're showing people how they could feasibly go on and build their own DIY archives is also really great as well. I think this is something that, like, I know I'm certainly going to take into like other roles in other places, and this kind of knowledge that, like, if you are part of a DIY organization or a kind of a community that you feel is not particularly well represented, you can take steps to archive it yourself, which is really great. And yeah, I think that was really good. And I think also the fact that you guys like Museum of Youth Culture as an organization is quite good at integrating what we've collected into like youth work, or sort of like you were saying, like dementia charities, and sort of working with like other like sort of groups as well. I think that's quite nice, because that also feels like it's quite a sustainable thing. Like you're building, it's just it's nice to see that like feeding in as well, and it feels like it's going to continue to be used, and also continue to like have impact beyond like us collecting these things, which is good as well.
Oh, that's really nice feedback. Thank you. That's really cool to hear.
Yeah, I can add to that, and also just say how the more I was researching, I mean, this is something we've known, but just the links between politics, resistance, and clubbing and kind of the subculture of music, I think is really important, and something that hasn't really been spoken about with like the Asian community or Asian music. And a lot of the kind of acts that were involved in Asian underground, like the Joy Sound System, the State of Bengal, actually came out of like youth politics around Brick Lane and or like grassroots anti-racist organization. So I definitely think it's really important to always think about that.
Nice.
It's interesting, isn't it? You focus on one thing and then it kind of expands out from that, and you kind of get these other angles and stories around that. I think as we got 15 minutes left, we'll jump over to kind of questions that we've had so far. I'm just going to start with the ones that are already in the chat, but if someone would like to kind of speak up and ask a question directly or have a comment, if you click on reactions, you can put your hand up and then I'll find you, and you can unmute yourself and say something as well. So the first one, these are two for Amal, and I'm going to kind of bring them together into one. The first one is, during your interviews with South Asians from different generations, did you notice a gradual change in experiences? And then kind of following on from that, out of the many kind of stories you heard, was there a particular one that you identified with specifically?
Yeah. I guess the intergenerational one, surprisingly not as much as I thought. Like it was the same kind of like rebellious South Asian teenager whose family had just moved to the UK, who was getting involved in like clubbing scenes and partying scenes in the UK and going out and experiencing like things that were not particularly normal within the realms of their households, like the way they dressed, the food they ate outside the house, the music they listened to, the spaces that they occupied. But a lot of it always came back to this idea of like the safe spaces that they entered were ones that I think had particular cultural motives that kind of resonated across the generations. And I think a big one was like music and food and just being part of a community. Particularly, I think, for when I'm thinking of ones where if there's people who grew up in like the 70s where like there was like massive racist protests like happening down someone's road. That was in one of the anonymous interviews, where the road he lived on had quite often really active racist mobs, and his house used to get attacked quite often. To younger generations who live in quite white and not very diverse areas who still face racism growing up. So it was like surprising that a lot hadn't particularly changed in terms of like themes, but it was the little things that I think were like, this is us bringing in our South Asian heritage into living in the UK every day. That was quite comforting, I think, for a lot of people, which was nice. And I think the one that I guess was most identifiable for me, oh God, which one was it? Oh, there was one with Mufti Mia. So he works with London Pride, and I think that one felt really identifiable for me as someone who's like queer and Asian. And him just talking about his experience of like growing up in Brighton in quite like a conservative family, but growing in like quite a female-centric environment where like cultural practice was really important, like family spaces are really important, the clothes, the food, and celebrating all of that, while also coming into like your queerness, which could often be quite taboo to talk about in his community and I guess in mine as well. Versus like as an adult, he's kind of moved out, grown into loving a lot of his own South Asian roots while also combining that with his queerness. And that was like a really nice journey to kind of hear and kind of resonate with. Yeah, that was really good.
Amazing. That does sound really brilliant. And I think it is nice when you listen to a lot of these stories, there's things that you can really relate to and kind of say, oh, that really speaks to me and my experiences. This is one for Jez. What have you been able to see in terms of the evolution of music culture through your interviews?
Oh, wow. Evolution. Well, I think evolution, it's a forever shifting culture. I think, you know, my particular interest goes way as far back as I can go. In terms of the interviews, I wouldn't say I've seen an evolution in the music. Music changes. You know, the biggest sort of way, or the best way to sort of describe it in terms of, you know, how it's described to me by different communities is Birmingham was a very industrial city. You know, back in the late 60s, early 70s, had a huge range of migrants coming to the city from Ireland, but from Asia, from the Caribbean, and they would often, you know, live, work, and play next to the indigenous, the white Brummies, for want of a better phrase. And out of that, you know, as I say, it's an industrial city. You'd have people working, you know, in the foundries and the factories, really loud, heavy, oppressive type workspaces. And that's where Black Sabbath were formed, probably the most famous, I imagine, band from Birmingham. And if you listen to what Black Sabbath, members of Black Sabbath say, they said our music could only be, you know, a result of where we worked and lived, the noise and the heat, and that was reflected in our music. But they were working next to Asian, and they were working next to Afro-Caribbean people, predominantly men. But those people weren't coming out and making heavy metal. They were coming out and reciting Punjabi folk songs or making Branga or blue beat and ska. So this evolution, or, you know, the evolution of music, it's never a static thing. It's always changing and morphing, and depending on the demographics of a city and the particular social and cultural times of the city. So I can't really answer that in terms of saying there is an evolution, except that the music of today in Birmingham is just as exciting as when I was growing up in the 80s. It's different. You know, a lot of it doesn't speak to me, but why would it? As a 50-year-old white bloke, you know, that I'm not their target audience, but I still see that music is absolutely central and endemic in individuals and communities, and as I said earlier, helps us identify who we are, and it speaks to us. It gives us experiential times. It expresses ourselves. It expresses, you know, helps us with moods. So it's forever evolving, and it's always really interesting to see, you know, what will happen next. So that's a bit of a fudge of an answer to that. It's quite a difficult question to answer.
Thank you, Jez. And this one's from Mira. South Asian pop music had a very vibrant scene in London and the Midlands in the 70s and 80s. I was wondering if you got to interview anyone who was part of this side.
When I started the research, I was definitely interested in kind of looking at South Asian music, you know, everywhere and across different time spans. But I definitely thought that sometimes when you're kind of looking at BAME histories or something, it's easy to kind of conflate like different musical subcultures that were happening at the same time. So I really wanted to focus particularly on Asian underground. But when I got to DJ Ritu's archive, it was just spanning like the entire course of British Asian history from when she first started. So the earliest kind of material I was looking at were flyers from the Bombay Jungle at the WAG Club in Soho, which was in 1993, I think it started. So I didn't talk to anybody that was earlier than that, but and her career also went on long after Asian Underground, and she still runs two of London's longest running club nights, I think, to this day. So but definitely something I would want to look more into.
Amazing. And then thank you, Mira. Tyler had one for us, and I think we touched on a little bit, but just about the outreach program, you know, having been in place for a while, and whether we're continuing to work on it further and kind of bring in additional people to explore groups and locations that are still underrepresented within the archive.
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think it's the the answer is yes to that. I mean, this has been a pilot study to see how it works, and you know, we always thought, you know, let's create a model first and see how we can get people involved. Obviously, like come up with a budget that we give people, and then we sort of worked it out from there. And that sort of has been a really sort of great process for us. I think for everybody involved as well to be. You know, we're very proud that we've got, you know, this amazing bunch as our sort of first outreach champion group. And, but yeah, I mean, we're definitely going to continue doing it. I think one of the challenges from our side has just been managing the content coming in, because we are a team of, a core team of 4 people. I mean, you know, sometimes less. So that's a challenge. And obviously we have a volunteer network which help us to do that. But obviously, you know, volunteers can only do so much. So, you know, you do have to sort of, we would like this to grow with us as we grow our core team as well. So at the moment, I think we're sort of at a point where we're sort of at capacity in terms of like the amount of people we can have at once to doing outreach. But we'd love it to have like, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 people at once still working on projects. Would be amazing. So it's really just a case of capacity at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's a really nice thing in terms of the agility as well of having a program like this and being able to really try and kind of work with people and give them the chance to kind of then decide what they want to focus on, but really pick on different areas. And I think just from looking at the stories we've got in, they're all so different and from so many different time periods and eras and different focuses. And I think that's been really exciting to see. We had Ben Stowe, who had a hand up to ask a question, and the hand's down now, but you still have a question you wanted to ask? And if so, you can unmute yourself and kind of speak to the group.
Oh, hi, sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question for Amal. So I thought the method of your calls for entry was really, really interesting. And this idea that a lot of South Asian stories get passed on through kind of like word of mouth, and often very kind of stigmatized issues aren't necessarily spoken about and written down and can really be taught in like an academic sense, for example, because a lot of the intricacies are, you know, too sensitive to speak about. So how do you think you'd bridge this gap between like making sure to capture these very like sensitive personal issues, as well as kind of like incorporating it into like more mainstream histories as well?
Okay, that is a tricky one, to be fair, because I think when it comes to like quite sensitive taboo topics, like I was definitely a bit hesitant about it as well, because I think especially from when you're from like quite, like for example, like being queer and coming from quite a conservative background, I think coming forward and putting forward those narratives is already difficult enough. So putting that into like a mainstream audience and being able to put that on like a public platforms is something else entirely. But there are ways that have been done, like for example, like there's like a number of groups in London like Hidayah and Iman LGBTQ, which are amazing community organizations that do work on getting outreach to people who want to like share, do oral interviews as well, I think, but also just get people to volunteer. And I think also it's about kind of practicing that kind of history that comes with it. So I think for a lot of oral interviews, having people who can access community groups that are actually safe and where you can hold those discussions is like a really good step for understanding, well, what ways can we make history more accessible to the public and for younger generations especially. I think that was like my main thing of like, well, how easily is this like digestible to a public audience? Because I think when it comes to things like academia, it can be really elitist and there's a lot of barriers when you kind of get into the entries and things like that. So having like online museums like Museum of Youth Culture and things like this is really important, I think, of just making it as easy and straightforward as possible to access archives and materials that are just very easily identifiable. So I think that would kind of, I hope that answers the question, but that would kind of be my main approach to it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really cool answer.
Amazing. I think that's really interesting. And I think that's kind of one of the things that I've been working on, getting everything on the website, which is going to be going live in the kind of next couple of weeks, is how do you show these really amazing stories and kind of do them justice on a digital platform and kind of showcase these collections and how they interconnect with each other, where you really feel that the voice is being represented. And I think actually moving from an archive to a museum, that's been one of the most difficult things, is how do we tell stories and make sure that the stories we tell are accessible and we're sensitive to the different sensitivities and kind of different narratives within those stories. So I think generally that's something that museums on the whole struggle with. We've got a question here from Jez for Jamie and Lisa. What are your thoughts on collecting contemporary culture? How do you do this, if so?
It's been a real challenge, actually. I mean, a lot of the work that comes in from the sort of like the organic submissions we have, I say a lot, I mean the opposite, actually. A small percentage of images that come through organically are of like modern culture, but it's something that like we've sometimes we've had an amazing photographer who's come up to us and said, look, I've just documented like a queer rave, for example. Look at these amazing pictures I've got, and I've shot them on film, and they sort of feel like they fit with the archive. And then we've sort of uploaded them, and we sort of don't know where they fit, and they sort of don't necessarily work that well with some of the other content because of the sort of age gap. So Lisa has a list of like photographers that are sort of almost ready to join the archive, but maybe give it a few years. And that's not ideal, because we'd rather just be able to take them on board and have a collection for it. But it just doesn't feel right sometimes to put the brand new material in that was done like last week into stuff that's like 1960s and 1950s alongside it. But saying that, we still do have some work that our like both existing photographers, like free party photographers, for example, that still shoot in the same way, and the free parties look like they could be the 90s, and that sort of works quite well. But we even have some like contributors that like are really young and have documented like their own youth, and it sort of fits. So yeah, it's just strange because we do have a long list of photographers that want to get involved, but we sort of work with them on a more as and when basis. So I'm thinking about that photographer, Lisa, that we worked with on the Notting Hill exhibition, where we were looking for images of Notting Hill, and we really needed some modern contemporary images, and we found this guy who had amazing work. We sort of like got him involved with the exhibition, but sort of didn't put him in the archive afterwards. So I don't know, it's sort of a sort of in progress sort of thought at the moment, I think, in terms of how we keep contemporary histories in the collection as well.
I think one thing that we really try and do as well in terms of our education program is giving young people the tools around how do you document kind of your youth and your scene, and how do you collect oral histories, and how do you kind of take photography or kind of like go beyond kind of, you know, snaps and kind of actually documenting a culture. And hopefully, I think part of that idea is that it will come back and then come back into the archive in quite an organic loop. So I think in terms of contemporary collecting, I think there is that element of it where we're really trying to pass on to young people today how they can do these things themselves, and that kind of more organically comes into the archive a bit later, because it is really difficult to kind of have things as they're coming in that are happening now. When we do exhibitions or we talk about a scene, we want to make sure, and we always make sure it goes up to the present, so there's always that continuation through. But I think also just because of where we are as an archive and working towards a museum, we have also had to focus a little bit more on kind of pre-70s youth culture movements, because the archive wasn't that strong there for a long time, and they're really at-risk histories. And if we want to collect, you know, living memory and oral histories, we really need to do that now. So I think in some ways, when we have done a bit more kind of active collecting ourselves as the museum, we have focused a bit more on that side, because if we don't do that now, we won't ever be able to do that. I'm very aware that we're now running over time. So if anyone has any kind of last minute, really kind of burning questions to ask, please do that now. And otherwise, if you've got any questions, you can shoot them over to our email address. I'll pop it in the chat. You know, we're always around and always happy to answer any questions. But I also wanted to really thank our outreach champions that are here today, and the three that couldn't be here, for their amazing work. we weren't really sure how this program was going to go. It was definitely a trial, even more so when we had to run the program in lockdown. But I think we've been really blown away by kind of the amazing stories we've had in through it, and kind of this has really got us thinking about how we can collect for the future, and what a museum of youth culture could look like. So it's been really amazing having you on board with this, and kind of the work you've done has been incredible.
You've all really helped shape a museum of youth culture. So yeah, I think you should be really proud.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just popping our email address in the chat box. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All right, bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.